she was very active in a place called Furnace Town, which is the Nasawango Iron Furnace near Snow Hill, a historic site that's been developed as a tourist attraction. And I suppose Kathy Fisher, as much as anybody, has been responsible for its. The Fishers were participating in one of the world's 3 largest collectible hobbies, which are, you probably know, what was that? See where I'm going here? There we go. Numismatics, philatry, and deltiology. I didn't even know that word, deltiology. Maybe you don't either, and you've been collecting postcards all this time, but there it is. And despite the more sophisticated terms applied to these pastimes, the imagery of each, that is on postcards and stamps especially, can be relatively commonplace. And they can range from culture, whether it's Norman Rockwell or Walt Disney, on stamps, to vernacular and landmark architecture. You may remember the stamp collection, effectively, or the series that featured American landmark buildings, or scenes known nationally or in postcards of buildings that may be more familiar to the town in which these are. This is one of the oldest hotels in Ocean City, Maryland. Still there, by the way, although it's really rare that these of this age would still be there. Coins and stamps employed all kinds of neoclassical and national themes, with both featuring profiles, which you find on both types of collectibles, featuring profiles of kings and queens and presidents, and in the case of the United States, Native Americans and Lady Liberty. Stamps and postcards also displayed scenes of local landscapes, such as the 10-cent stamp of the Great Smoky Mountains and the landscape seen along the road to Ocean City from about the 1915 to maybe 30 era. Postcard subjects also branched out beyond everyday subjects to sentimental greetings, and you of course know about those sentimental cards and even novelty cards, where art can turn to kitsch and also reach into these sort of cartoon and humorous greeting from wherever it is, laughable cards. So herein lies the rationale for Arcadia's series. The photography in a number of these cards can be quite meritorious, and the manipulations of composition, as well as the tonality of printing and the various printing effects of hand-painted postcards, are most notably artistic in their own right. And pictures of local businesses and places, professions, daily activities, recreational pursuits, as recorded on postcards, ultimately provides a visual documentation of history itself, which is why I got interested in it. I'm not a postcard expert, but I got interested in how you collect visual representations of older buildings initially, but street scenes and urban scenes and the like. So that is one of the reasons that Arcadia Publisher has this extraordinary series called The Images of America, went into this sideline of the history of the postcard book series, same format as the familiar sepia-covered Images of America book series that you all know. And the Bob and Kathy Fisher postcard collection is featured in these 2 most recent books. This is the one on historic lodgings of Ocean City, and the second one, the historic Boardwalk, Beach, and Bay. The historic lodgings is an effort to trace changing accommodation for tourists who come into Ocean City. Give you some idea that when I was growing up in Ocean City, let's say in the 50s and the 60s, the year-round population of Ocean City was somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000. On a good weekend in the summer, it was 300,000. They all came from Baltimore, Washington, Philadelphia, but mostly Baltimore and Washington, just swarmed down to the Eastern Shore for their summer holidays and rent someplace, whether it was a hotel room or a tourist camp or one of those sort of pre-motel groups of cabins in a U-shaped form, or an early motel, There was a Robert Venturi-like Motel Row in Ocean City for a period of time, about 15 blocks of what one author wrote, entitled a book, Doo-Wop Motels. It's a great title, I think, and all from that era. And then also ultimately reaches, as happened in Panama City, condo towers, these 20 and 30-story concrete blocks that people buy as investments and rent out. So the Fisher collection includes postcards from the recent past as well as from the earliest years of the 20th century, which of course is the pioneer era of postcards, when even American companies were distributing imported penny cards, mostly from Germany, and when the postcard culture was spreading to the point of becoming epidemic. Just to give you an idea, and some of you may be aware of this, this is a sort of view of the railroad depot early in the history of Ocean City. In a single year from June of 1907 to 1908, in June, about the time the railroad station postcard was printed, and by the way, when the population of the United States was less than 89 million, the entire country was 89 million, and yet there were 677 million postcards mailed that year, just in that single year. By the 1900s, the largest manufacturer of postcards, the Curt Teich Company, was printing millions of postcards every year. The company founder was a German immigrant named Curt Otto Teich, and is said to have been extremely liberal, if not indiscriminate, in accepting pretty much every project proposal that passed through the company's door. He would print anything as a postcard, and did. And throughout the company's 80-year history, hundreds of thousands of different images and postcard views of historic buildings and famous people and objects of art, celebrations and holidays, streetscapes, landscapes, seascapes, any scape you want to put on that, were all in these postcard views. And the Curt Teich Postcard Archive today, which is now in the Newberry Library in Chicago, contains more than 500,000 unique postcard images at individual scenes on postcards, 500,000 of them. The subjects extended from coast to coast, and within the Fisher collection, the postcards of Ocean City's buildings and boardwalk and beach and bay and ocean include a substantial number of Curt Teich postcards from several periods. Well, I want to say a bit more about Curt Teich a little bit later, but just as the postcard imagery of hotels and motels and related tourist buildings collected in historic lodgings of Ocean City provides an architectural history of Maryland's beach resort, so the companion volume in the Fisher collection, postcards of the boardwalk views, beach scenes, picturesque imagery of sailing on the Sinnepuxon Bay, or the many moods of the Atlantic Ocean. This offers a visual representation of Ocean City's recreational activities. Tourists go there to engage in recreational sunbathing, sailing, fishing, water sports, which in the early days was known as fanny dipping in the Victorian era. Postcard styles ranged from photographic snapshot imagery to hand-colored tonal pictures to novelty cards, including cartoons stenciled over, as well as what is familiar in almost any town, the so-called greetings from series of postcards with large letter stencils in which different views of historic buildings, local businesses, natural landscapes are framed inside the big letters which spell out the name of the city or town. And of course, Curt Teich could put at the top greetings from and then spell any town in the United States underneath it and sell hundreds of these, if not thousands. Within the postcard subject, is that disturbing? I don't know if that's me with this. Within the postcard subject is a building, a boardwalk, a beach, or a bay scene, and you can see some of these are collected in this group of postcards. And of course, both books are subtitled the Fisher Collection to give credit and honor to this group of collectors in a nearby town. Now, whether the postcard is of a building or the boardwalk, beach, or bay, a well-developed postcard collection such as the Fisher Collection serves the cultural historian with an unrivaled pictorial documentation of the past. And in these 2 companion volumes on Ocean City, Maryland, part of the Arcadia America Postcard History book series, you'll find a visual history of everyday life of Americans on vacation. It really is universal. It could be any coastal town in America. It just happens to use the postcards of Ocean City as a way to get at the kinds of activities of housing people for the weekend or whatever it might be. And of course, the postcard has its own history, and indeed prehistory. Printed postcards could not exist, of course, without the movable type printing press, invented in Germany by Johann Gutenberg, who was a goldsmith. He invented this movable type press around 1440, and it was revolutionary in as much as hand printing could produce only about 40 pages in a good hard work day, whereas the Renaissance movable type presses could produce up to 3,600 pages in a workday. And by the year 1500, printing presses were operating throughout the Western Europe, producing more than 20 million volumes and increasing tenfold during the 16th century. So it just, blossomed more than virtually exploded. And as printed material became more widespread, visiting business cards or invoice bill heads and writing paper began to include illustrations, some with delicate engravings at the top or top and bottom sometimes. By 1777, a French engraver named de Maison published in Paris sheets of cards with printed greetings intended to be cut and mailed through the French postal system. Although the idea in 1777 did not appeal to the aristocrats, can you guess why? They were concerned that the servants could read the messages. And so this sense of privacy and whatever they were sending to their closest friends was problematic. In 1840, in England, Sir Rowland Hill proposed postal reform for the UK, including a unified cost for domestic mail delivery set at 1 penny per envelope. The postage was to be prepaid by the penny black. You can see a group of 6 of those penny blacks. The world's first adhesive postal stamp issued on printed sheets. We use them all the time now, of course, and first appearing in May of 1840. 3 years later, during the same year that Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol was published, 1843, printers began to create the first Christmas greeting cards. That was actually done by Sir Henry Cole, which may be a name familiar to you. Sir Henry Cole is the one who organized the great 1851 Crystal Palace exhibition in London, which was the first World's Fair held anywhere. In the United States, Congress passed a law in 1861 allowing privately printed cards weighing no more than 1 ounce to be sent through the mail. John Carleton of Philadelphia and Hyman Lipman both printed cards for this purpose, an early type including the statement, copyright secured 1861, presumably by Carleton. But the other fellow, Lipman, got his name affixed to these because they became known as Lipman cards and were fairly widely spread. And that printed notation said patent applied for on the top left corner. I don't know if you can, well, you probably can't read that. It does say Lipman postal card on the top left and some other data. Lipman had been the founder of the first envelope company in the United States and was the inventor, by the way, of the lead pencil with an eraser attached to it at the top. However, research as late as 2019 in the Library of Congress copyright records and the post office documents suggest that neither Carleton nor Lipman actually did secure a patent for anything. They just printed it on the cards, thinking that would discourage, anybody else from competing with their enterprise. Early Lipman cards were sold to various businesses that printed advertisements or illustrations on the reverse side, such as these advertisement cards for Esther Brooks Steel Pens or Cameo Press. Both these cards were posted in 1872 and may be the first pictorial postcards mailed in the United States. Now, I put these sort of firsts and all this stuff with some trepidation because I know there are a bunch of postcard experts in the audience, and I got a lot of gall giving this presentation to all you experts. But anyway, in June 8, 1872, a piece of legislation then approved government production of postal cards, with the first issued May 1st, 1873. Only these government cards could be called postal cards, U.S. postal cards, and mailed for a penny. If you created a private postcard, it would cost 2 cents postage, twice as much to mail. One side of the card was for the message, the other was for the address. In the meantime, in Germany, a parallel development was unfolding. In 1865, at the Karlsruhe Postal Conference, it was an Austria/German conference, Heinrich von Stephan introduced a proposal for what was called Offenes Postblatt, open post sheets. His purpose was to reduce the cost and the paper and the effort involved in sending short messages. And his idea was to create a rigid card, approximately the size of a postal envelope, but with postage pre-printed, negating the need for an envelope. The post office was not enthusiastic. They feared that every German state would issue their own stamps and implementation would be costly. Von Stephan had been a postal clerk since 1849, so he was doing this as a sort of inside job, and he was promoted through the ranks so that ultimately, a good 35 years later in 1895, he was awarded the post of Minister of Postal Services. So I guess he got his way eventually in making this work. The actual birth, there is one of these correspondence carts of this type. The actual birth of the postcard is generally accepted to be October 1st, 1869, with the appearance in Austria-Hungary of the correspondence cart, which is what you're seeing here. Essentially, von Stephan's earlier rejected idea, an 8.5 by 12 centimeter rectangular light brown card with a 2 Kreuzer stamp imprinted at the top right corner on the address side, half the price of mailing a normal letter, and the reverse side to be used for a short message. This correspondence cart was postmarked Linz, the one we're looking at, Linz, Austria. I don't know if you know or have ever been to Linz, but it's where Adolf Hitler grew up as a kid and where he intended to retire had things gone a different way. The correspondence cart idea was to be adopted by the Austro-Hungarian authorities, was now promoted by Dr. Hermann, an economics professor from Vienna, who argued in an article in the New Free Press that time and energy were wasted in writing letters. That's an interesting thing for today's society. Time and efforts were wasted in writing longhand letters. What became the progenitor of the modern postcard was more practical and cheaper for short communications. The institution of his idea by the Austrian Post in 1869 is considered the birthday, essentially, on October 1st of the postcard. And in 2020, October 1st was launched at as the World Postcard Day by Post Crossing, which is a website platform established about, I don't know, 20 years ago, I think, 2005. And as mentioned earlier, the United States Post Office Department issued America's first postal cards without pictures in 1873, 4 years after the Austrian inauguration and 2 years before the founding of Ocean City, Maryland, which is why the postal collection is interesting, because it's right at the town is founded about the time that these postcards are kickstarting. During the 1880s, small sketches or designs known as vignettes began to be printed on the message side of these earlier postcards. At first, these images were in black and white, but in Germany, as Germany began to develop and dominate the industry of chromolithography, color appeared, and a large percentage of postcards were printed in Germany. Many included views of local towns with the word Gruß aus, which is greetings from, the same thing we saw earlier, printed adjacent to the image and leaving additional blank space for the sender to write a short message. The Eiffel Tower, you know, was built for a World's Fair in 1889 at the Exposition Universelle. It was featured on postcards mailed from Paris from the World's Fair and engraved by Charles Le Bonny. The postcards were popular and became known as Le Bonny cards, and were likely an inspiration for the first U.S. commercially produced pictorial cards printed as souvenirs at the next World's Fair, which was in Chicago, the great Columbian 1893 fair. The U.S. Post Office issued its first picture postcards in 1893 at the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition, illustrating scenes from the Great White City's World's Fair. That same year, in 1893, an act of Congress permitted privately printed postcards to be mailed at the same penny rate as the government 1-cent cards for the official postal cards that were issued by the United States Post Office Department. So they came together in terms of price. And as a result, the private production of souvenir cards and the popularity of picture postcards increased substantially. The development paralleled colorful commercial advertising folded trade cards, which you may have seen in old museum collections, such as these for broadhead dress goods. These were not mailed, but mailable business advertisement cards were printed during the same period, although with restrictions regarding style and layout. During the so-called pioneer era, that is pre-1898, postcards mostly from New York and other major metro areas had an address side and filled the reverse side with commercial advertisement. At the time, privately printed postcards were known as souvenir cards or correspondence cards or simply mail cards. Then in 1898, Congress, which is prone to do this, got in on the act, permitted private printing companies to produce postcards so long as the following statement was printed on the card. Quote, private mailing card authorized by Act of Congress of May 19th, 1898. And here you can see one of those early cards with that information. Again, the messages were not allowed on the address side of these private mailing cards, although the postage was now the same, 1 cent, as was the government postal cards. Any written communication was limited to whatever available space was adjacent to the image, if there was an image on the reverse side. The further printed annotation of postal card or carte postale, that is, if you wrote that on your card, then you could also send the card internationally. If that wasn't on there, you had to do it just domestically. The early picture side of even privately printed postcards was given over to mainly advertising. An additional message writing was disallowed on the address and stamp side of the card, although messages were scrawled in empty border spaces around the imagery on the photo side. And you can see the bottom right-hand postcard, they squeezed in whatever is left over from the photo imagery. And of course, photography is a major role in this, began to appear on postcards during the 1890s with subjects ranging from town scenes and landmark buildings to landscapes and seascapes. And in 1903, Eastman Kodak produced what they called the number 3A folding pocket camera, whose negatives were not accidentally exactly the same size, 3.5 by 5.5, as a postcard. This took photography out of the professional studios and into the hands of the general public and allowed the direct printing of a photographic subject on postcard stock without cropping. Even family portraits and snapshots could be turned into postcards because it was allowing a color, an image side. And these are a variety of cards from that would have come out of that camera in terms of size from 40s and the 50s. Finally, in 1907, the postcard as we know it appeared with a split back for address on one side, message on the other side, and with the front devoted to an image. That's what we think of as we think of a postcard. Address on one side, message on the other side, and then flip the card and the images on the front. The Smithsonian Institute has described the development. Quote, this change was prompted by the Universal Postal Congress, the legislative body of the Universal Postal Union. The convention decreed that postal cards produced by governments of member nations could have messages on the left half of the address side effective October 1st, 1907. The Universal Postal Congress was decreed that after March 1st, 1907, government-produced cards in the United States could bear messages on the address side. Congress passed an act on March 1st, 1907, in compliance with the overall Union's decree, allowing privately produced postcards to bear messages on the left half of the card's back. The next day, the Postmaster General issued Order Number 146, granting privileges to privately produced postcards that were already granted in international mail. In other words, they could mail these internationally, but they really couldn't even do it locally until that order was passed, including the allowance of message space. And finally, on June 13th, 1907, the Postmaster General issued Order Number 539, which allowed government-produced postcards to bear messages on the left-hand side of the address as well. So between 1901 and 1907, the publication of printed postcards doubled almost every 6 months as this capacity, writing and image and all the rest of it loosened up. European publishers opened American branch offices and imported millions of mostly German printed postcards, supplying over 75% of all postcards sold in the United States by 1907. That's an interesting fact, that if you take all the thousands, if not millions of postcards that were being printed or being sold in the United States, 75%, 3 out of 4 of them came from Germany. They would get a scene sent to Germany, use the better chromolithography printing press and process and presses in Germany, and maybe 6 months later they'd get their card, and then it would appear in pharmacies and various other places to be sold. Most American postcard business could not match the quality of the German printers. Although production and delivery delayed receipt of cards by 6 to 12 months, the imported postcards were less expensive and certainly printed better. By the late 1890s, and so we come back to Curt Teich, a German immigrant who grew up in the printing trade had already moved to Chicago by the 1890s, where at just 21 years old, he established his own printing firm in 1898. Curt Teich was born in Germany, grew up in the picturesque medieval castle town of Lobenstein. His grandfather, Friedrich Teich, established a print shop in town and published a local newspaper. In the mid-19th century, Curt's father, Christian Teich, acquired several additional newspapers, as well as a publishing company and printing firm in Dresden. In the early 1890s, Christian and Curt's older brother Maximilian traveled to Chicago in hopes of establishing some business connections at the Columbian World's Fair. Everybody went to Chicago in the 1890s, certainly for that fair, but also to perhaps make business contacts. Max stayed in the Windy City, first as a waiter, but soon invested in real estate, where he became a major Chicago hotelier. And he had several hotels and was able to then help subsidize Curt's efforts in printing. Then in 1895, his brother Curt booked passage to the United States, worked briefly in print shops in New York, but by 1898, he too was in Chicago, where his already well-established brother Max helped him to set up the printing business with an office in the Industry Building, which is about 3 blocks outside the Chicago Loop, just north of the river, which means that this building wasn't built yet, but not so far from where the Chicago Tribune building is today. Teich described post-World's Fair Chicago as overcrowded with every trade and profession, with competition fierce and price-cutting prevalent. At first, Teich projected a broad corporation plan in printing, lithography, publishing, and importing art printing and souvenirs, but by necessity, Curt specialized in job, newspaper, and magazine publishing. That would soon change. A more romantic recollection of Teich's formative years later emerges and becomes sort of company lore coming out of the Curt Teich Postcard Company. The story is more remarkable due to the fact that Curt Teich's youth was as it was. He was barely 21. He obviously could not speak English that well. He'd just come from Germany. Nonetheless, in his 1958 memoir, looking back, entitled The Teich Family Tree and History, Curt Teich recorded that once his printing business was set up in Chicago, he immediately recognized the potential of the new phenomena of view postcards. And he embarked in what was to be a productive railroad trip to solicit postcard orders. He traveled by train from Chicago to St. Petersburg, Florida, and then on to the West Coast. Apparently, as he says, I don't know how you do this without an open pass, whatever, and have to wait half the day for the next train, but disembarking at each stop to photograph businesses on main streets in small towns, collecting on that trip $30,000 worth of orders. Now that's the equivalent of something like $1 million today. So it's a little bit of a company lore, I guess. I mean, I guess you can believe it if you want. But anyway, it was also a marketing research exercise to provide feedback from businessmen and town leaders and other potential customers for his postcard venture. What images they sought, how they wanted their businesses represented, how they wanted their town represented. So he talked to chambers of commerce. Sometimes he would put anything on the postcard, as I mentioned earlier. Here's one that's not a happy subject about the KKK. But on the other hand, through the years, many images were edited by touch-up artists, adding and subtracting whatever they thought was desirable or undesirable. This is a beach scene from Ocean City, Maryland. And I can guarantee you that some of those people and a lot of those umbrellas are painted on. They're not in the original photograph, just in how those were typically set up in any case. This, of course, is in the days before Photoshop. They just simply did it in the shop. The postcard itself, of course, was in transition. So to summarize what we've noted so far, at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, view cards were initially merely souvenir and not particularly compatible with the official government postal card regulations of the day. Privately made cards cost 2 cents to mail rather than a penny for the government official postcards. One side was reserved for postage and address only, while the view side left only a small edge to squeeze in some kind of a message. This is, of course, the typical divided one. The standard rate of 1 cent, the penny postcard, was established in 1898, and 9 years later, in 1907, the divided back, as we see here, was introduced, creating an address right side and message left side. And of course, the whole tradition of postal rates for postcards bounced back and forth between 1 and 2 cents between 1873 and 1958. 1958, you could still mail a postcard for a penny. Just as a matter of curiosity, here's a summary of postal inflation relevant to rising some 20 times in cost since 1958. 1973 to 1952, nearly 80 years, mailing postcards cost 1 cent, except during World War I and for 3 years in the 20s, 25 to 28, when it went up to 2 cents, but then went right back down to 1 cent. It was raised permanently to 2 cents in 1952. In 1958, it was 3 cents. 1963, it was 4 cents. 1968, it was 5 cents. 1978, it was 10 cents. 1988, it was 15 cents. 1995, it was 20 cents. And by the year 2022, 40 cents, with plans to rise it to 44 cents. And today, I think it's 48 cents. I'm not absolutely sure because I am not mailing postcards these days. But standardized pricing in the divided back with full image view on the postcard front was not the panacea for Curt Teich's postcard business, however. The greatest obstacle for American postcard makers was that during the first decade of the 20th century, an estimated 75 to 90% of all postcards sold in the United States were imported from Germany, where advantageous lithograph printing techniques produced cheaper picture postcards of noticeable higher quality. The Germans had a virtual monopoly over the postcard industry. Photographs of even the most remote American rural site were typically sent to Germany for printing and returned as postcards. So in 1904, the year Curt Teich incorporated his American Photochrome Company, he decided to go back to Germany and check it all out. His research of new lithography and printing methods, as well as distribution practices, might give him an edge on the American market, he thought. And he was right. In Germany, Curt found a postcard industry that had been thriving since the early 1890s, particularly with these Gruß aus, greetings from postcards, which we've mentioned before. And here you can see one of these German cards on the bottom. Well, both of these are examples. And you could fill in whatever. The top one is greetings from Waisenhof. These provided business owners and municipalities and chambers of commerce a means to advertise their businesses, to feature local tourist attractions, and to promote the town itself. And when Curt returned from Germany, he would make the stenciled greetings from postcard a major feature of his own production. But he was not the only American opportunist to try to cash in on the postcard publishing business. Even his brother Alfred, who had briefly partnered with Curt, jumped ship and started a firm called the Alfred Teich Company to compete with Curt Teich Company. So Curt returned to his American Photochrome Company back to its original name, Curt Teich Company. Rival postcard producers were popping up everywhere. The Detroit Publishing Company, E.C. Crop Company in Milwaukee, the American News Company in New York, the Albert Type Company in Brooklyn, and the greatest competitor, the Boston postcard company called Tickner Brothers Incorporated. Maybe Tishner, I'm not sure if it's Tishner or Tickner. The Fisher collection contains postcards from Albert Type, Tishner Brothers, and other Curt Teich rivals, as well as a lot of Curt Teich photographs, as one might expect. This, by the way, is one of the rivals companies' production factory on the top of that screen. In Chicago itself, entrepreneurs in Printers Row and across the city sought to corner their own part of the growing market, including the Illinois Postcard Company, C.R. Childs Company, and Alfred Holtzman, who is producing these cards from the company headquarters that you see on the top. Albert Holtzman was claiming to be the largest postcard plant in the world during the first decade of the 1990s, employing some 300 workers. And in this promotional postcard, Holtzman advertises its own version of greetings from postcard craze. Printed on the back of this, the latest greeting card, is the option, the name of your town printed here, where Chicago is actually showing up on his sample card. And the picture side could read, I don't know if you can read any of that on those two postcards. Well, here I am in fill in the blank, Chicago, Illinois, enjoying its sights and cheer. Everything's great and I'm feeling first rate, but oh, how I wish you were here. Is that typical, kind of postcard greeting, literally printed on it. On the address side of the split card, carte postale is printed in more than a dozen languages, emphasizing that the card can be cheaply mailed around the world. And in the message half is another kitsch poem. Don't let this surprise you, but gently remind you of the letters you promised to write. If you have any time to drop me a line, here's hoping you'll do so tonight. So that was, you didn't even have to think of what your message is, you just send it on like that. Sentimental camellias notwithstanding, Holtzman and the other postcard companies were no match for Curt Teich Company and his lithographic images. In 1907, Teich began promoting a new line of CT Processes view cards, assisted by his art director, another German, Otto Buttner. He was also a native of the same town that Teich came from, and the print department manager, another, he was Austrian, not German. And the double printing method, rephotographing on two plates, one copper and one zinc, brought out the finest details produced by the camera. ensured an even image in which the picture stands up, faithfully reproduces color, tint, and tone, and shows highlights. He was beginning to master what made the German cards so special: shadow, detail, and undistorted perspective. And moreover, Teich invested in new, you can see them on the bottom here, high-speed offset rotary printing presses that could print 32 different card designs in full color on a single sheet. Inspired by offset lithography, he observed in Germany, Teich was able to overprint 4 color inks, yellow, red, blue, and pink, and the new process he called his CT, Curt Teich, American Art process. And sometimes some of your cards will have that printed on the bottom of the card. He was soon able to print more than 100 cards per sheet and roughly 500,000 postcards per day per machine coming out of that Chicago building. But the habit was people still were looking to Germany, so he had to compete with that. And thank heavens for the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act. In 1909, Congress passed the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act, which turned out to be a godsend for American postcard printers, especially Curt Teich. Although tariffs had long been a major source of federal revenue and a protectionist device for American manufacturing, as the national economy grew and such taxes were questioned during the Progressive era. A lot of the progressives said, no, we don't want to have all these tariffs. William Howard Taft won election in part by campaigning on tariff reform, promising to veto any bill that did not lower tariff rates. House Representative Sereno Payne, at the left here, introduced a bill calling for such reductions, but when it reached the Senate, you can well imagine, the senators objected, led by Rhode Island Senator Nelson Aldrich. He was a dedicated protectionist. He pushed through amendments raising hundreds of rates on the bill. The bill that President Taft ultimately signed lowered tariff rates on 650 items, raised rates on 220, and made no change on 1,150. All of that's interesting, but has nothing to do with postcards except the rates that help to do with postcards. Significantly for American postcard printers was the Payne-Aldrich Act's imposition of a new import duty on all postcards from Germany. Congress solved the problem. Although every American printing house celebrated the coup, only one could really take full advantage, and that was Curt Teich. He'd just left Germany, found out what they were doing, imported his printing presses, knew what the chromolithography technique was, and was able to put it into practice. So he substantially increased the printing of his own cards, millions of them, and continued to do so for 7 decades. He died in 1974, and the company ultimately closed in 1978. And although Curt Teich and Company printed postcard views of over 100 countries, the bulk of the Curt Teich postcard output comprised scenes of small-town America, the hotels and stores, churches and public buildings. This happens to be one of the hotels in Ocean City, Maryland. It's in the book. And landscapes of effectively American vernacular culture. The Curt Teich Company illustrated scenes of over 10,000 cities and towns across the United States. And with the rise of the automobile, these small towns became destinations. And in the case of Ocean City, Maryland, virtually every hotel, motel, and public building, as well as street view, boardwalk, and beach scene, and bay and ocean seascapes became subject matters from this guy in Chicago who was sending his photographers literally everywhere. When a bridge spanned the Chesapeake Bay near Annapolis in 1952, the number of travelers from Baltimore and Washington, of which I believe one is sitting here now, went to Ocean City, increased substantially. And Ocean City's population, as I mentioned, of a few thousand residents in the winter would blossom to 300,000. I was intrigued as a kid as to how they knew how many people really were in Ocean City, and they did it by toilet flushes, because there were all these, huge hotels. I don't know how they monitored even that, but that's what they claimed. Curt Teich's success reflected other early developments in postcard history we've already mentioned. 2 years before the Payne-Aldrich Act in March of 1907, the format of the postcards changed, we've noted, with these divided backs, now permitting address and message on one side and a full view image on the other. And that began to be idealized with developments in tonal printing, different hand coloring, various photographic, even the card stock, linen textured and painterly manipulations on the cards. During the next 8 to 10 pre-World War I years, the public tastes for postcards skyrocketed. Curt Teich produced roughly 150 million postcards a year, many distributed through 5 and dime stores, Woolworth store, the Plaza Drugs, whatever, wherever it was going to be, he'd have the postcards. During the 1930s, and for 2 decades and more, the textured linen finish of a Curt Teich, what he called these CT art color chromes, became the familiar style of Teich postcards. Airbrushing distant pink skies, they weren't there, he just airbrushed the pink in there. Fluffy pastel clouds at sunset, these became almost Curt Teich manipulations and signatures on his cards. After the company closed in 1978, the Curt Teich color process was purchased in 1980 by John Hine Limited, an Irish company, in 1956 by photographer John Hine. Here are some of his late bright colored postcards. He was producing 32 million postcards 10 years later, but mostly scenes of Ireland and the UK. Hine photographic images taken on a large format camera were manipulated to produce a retro color saturated realism. Now, to get a sense of this, Hollywood was doing the same thing in producing 1939 Wizard of Oz, and just Technicolor was what they called it initially in these various Hollywood films. Wizard of Oz was 39, Walt Disney's Fantasia was 1940, so you can see this is kind of what's happening with these intensified color-rich imagery. And to some degree, the Curt Teich color process was looking to do similar kinds of things. But it's like a still life painter setting up his objects of a projected work of art. Artists like Curt Teich and John Hine removed and added people or cars or bushes or other objects from the scenes in order to optimize their artistic vision. I've often been amused that sometimes you'll see a postcard that'll say sunset over the ocean in Ocean City. And that only works if Ocean City's on the Pacific coast, not on the Atlantic coast. And then you'll see another one like this one on the right, which is this oriental thing with rock outcroppings and distant volcanoes on the skyline. None of that is in Ocean City off the coast of Maryland, but it made for a romantic light. While casual purchasers of postcards may not be aware of this art consciousness, the artistic merits of the postcard series were not accidents, not mere snapshot photography, but carefully orchestrated compositions. And so when you pick up any of these books in the postcard history series that Arcadia is specializing now, you'll find all kinds of picturesque, even scenographic postcards of moonlight sailing on the bay, the magical moods of the ocean, bathers on the shore, perambulations at night on the famous Ocean City Boardwalk. As I say, the card on the right couldn't possibly be there. I had a good friend on the second book. There was a section because Ocean City, part of the recreation in Ocean City, Maryland, is deep sea fishing. And when Franklin Delano Roosevelt came down to Ocean City and was taken out to go deep sea fishing, to basically go marlin fishing, he was so struck by the fact that there were all these white marlin especially, but blue marlin as well, off the coast of Ocean City, that he dubbed Ocean City the white marlin capital of the world. And that's been one of the slogans of the city for many years. Just to give you an idea about this, they have had a white marlin fishing tournament, which is also, it has some high entry, but they'll somehow have several hundred boats go out over this 1 week, and they give prizes that you would not believe. I mean, literally, the first prize, I think this year, it just ended a week ago, was something like $1.3 million for the biggest billfish that came in on that particular thing. And they know when they catch one that's not big enough, and they let them loose. They don't bring them all in, but if they're even close to where they think might be one of the winning, it's worth a lot. And sometimes they've invested $30,000 and $40,000 to even enter it. The entry fee is not that, but they enter these sort of legal gambling schemes that, depending on how many of those they sign up with, will increase their winnings if they do that. So anyway, once the company closed, the family decided they wanted to find some archive to house the postcard collection. The founder had made a practice, by the way, of retaining copies of literally every photograph and every postcard the company ever made from start to finish. The family, of course, had this vast archive of Curt Teich postcards and was looking for a place to house them. I learned about this several years ago at a conference where the museum director of a very small town southwest of Chicago called Lake County Discovery Museum had in Waconda, Illinois, a tiny little burg, had been given this entire collection, and it was overwhelming. But they started digitizing it. They developed all kinds of records and documenting it, and it became a kind of encyclopedia of town culture across the country. According to the Encyclopedia of Chicago History, that collection was the largest public collection of postcards in the world, including approximately 2.5 million postcards and more than 360,000 individual images of American life and culture, as well as subjects from 115 other countries. In late 2016, not so long ago, that whole collection was moved out of that small museum and moved to the Newberry Library in Chicago, where it's a little more accessible to a lot more people, presumably right in the heart of Chicago. In the meantime, private collectors nationwide amassed shoebox loads of postcards of local subjects, bought, sold, and traded cards at flea markets, and compiled notebooks and albums full of postcards depicting local scenes and places of historic interest. And as with Bob and Kathy Fisher, these individuals were active in preservation, saving some of the old local buildings, and raising the consciousness of fellow citizens regarding the importance of history in a civilized society. Curt Teich is extremely well represented in the Fisher collection, as you can well imagine, simply due to the number of views that they produced. A cursory view through the books or through the collection itself gives evidence of several contemporaries and competitors to Curt Teich in the postcard business. And I'm just going to mention a few of them because some of the postcards that you collect may be produced by these same companies, but they were Curt Teich's major competitors. Lewis Kaufman and Sons operated out of Baltimore and published regional postcard scenes of subjects from Pennsylvania to Virginia. If you hear this phrase, the Delmarva Peninsula, that's Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, with the abbreviations. And so from Philadelphia or Wilmington down to Norfolk, Lewis Kaufman was doing a lot. Contracting many of their images to be printed by Curt Teich, but using his offset printing process, but also distributing it through Lewis Kaufman. The Fisher collection includes postcards with borderless, painterly pictures of tonal atmospheric imagery, which, like the hand-colored postcards widely in evidence before World War I, many of these were locally distributed by the local pharmacy. And it's way too small to see, but on the bottom of a couple of these cards it says available at Frank Townsend's. He was a local pharmacy on Somerset Street and the Boardwalk, and that's where you'd go get some of these. Washington Pharmacy was his establishment. Other Kaufman, I think that's one that you can maybe see that written down there just below those perambulators on the Boardwalk. It says something about the Washington Pharmacy. Other Kaufman and Sons cards had plain white borders, which not only saved printers' ink, but were increasingly the norm, as well as Curt Teich production cards during that period of 1915 to 1930. They call it the white card border period, but just that 15 years from 1915 to 1930. And here you can see some examples of that. That's the local casino, which burned in 1925, and here's the Shaw's saltwater swimming pool right off the boardwalk. You could go the other direction, actually jump in the saltwater, but they would fill the swimming pool off the boardwalk during that period. The Albert Teich Company, founded in 1890 by Adolf and Hermann Widermann, employed new technologies such as Albert Teich to reproduce photomechanical images and created more than 25,000 prints between 1890 and 1952. And they were headquartered in Brooklyn. The company gathered photographic negatives from throughout the United States and printed them from a gelatin-coated plate using a process invented by another German photographer, Joseph Albert. The Albert Teich process employed glass plates rather than copper or lithographic stone used in collotype printing, in a process that printed about 2,000 prints from each gelatin silicate plate. And several postcards from the Fisher collection were identified as Albert Teich postcards. Postcards published by the rival firm in Boston, the Tickner Brothers, also represented in the Fisher collection. During the 1930s through World War II, Tickner Brothers published color postcards with linen texture, specialized in American vacation places, and were a significant competitor for Curt Teich. The Boston Public Library has a Tickner Brothers collection containing 25,000 office proofs of postcards by the firm, including greetings from, a whole series of those cards as well. The firm offered postcard scenes from across the United States, novelty cards, comic cards, cartoon cards, numerous beach and town views of Ocean City, many of which were collected by the Fishers and also appear in the two books. And then there were local photographers and publishers on the Eastern Shore who contributed to the postcard coverage of Ocean City's Boardwalk, Beach, Bay, and ocean attractions. Frederick W. Brookman's Tingle Printing Company was headquartered in Pittsville, Maryland. Now, Pittsville, Maryland probably has a whopping population of 2. It's a tiny little place, but Frederick Brookman had his Tingle Printing Company, and he produced postcards of Eastern Shore subjects, a lot of them in Ocean City, with his own photography dominating. But Brookman's photography was supplemented by occasional postcard images from the 1950s by others, including, if you can see the caption of the bottom one, a Tingle Printing Company beach scene photographed by Robert S. Craig, my father, who did 4 or 5 postcards for the Tingle Printing Company. And of course, my dad was captain of the lifeguards in Ocean City, so he obviously had to have an ocean lifeguard on a lifeguard stand in this particular view of one of his cards. It turned out that Fred Brookman's brother married my mother's sister too, so this particular connection with the Tingle Company is a distant connection. Delaware firms such as HPS of Dover, Delaware, Marketing Merchandise of Lewis, Delaware, produced striking images, usually later, and so when the 1970s produced high-rise condos along the north beach of Ocean City, not these quaint little cottages and hotels, then R.C. Pulling and Kevin Moore, very good photographers in their own right, illustrated the northern development of Ocean City along the beaches of Condo Row, as it came to be called. And by the date of these 1970s and 80s architectural developments, postcards were less popular forms of communication anyway, so they were fairly rare, and these look more like just photographs, which is what a lot of that period is going to look like. Curt Teich itself had closed in 1978, and that's virtually the 73 to 78 is when that whole row was built in Ocean City, right at that moment of the closure. What replaced all those postcards? I'm sure you have your own notion of that. And here are a few final dates and means of communication to ponder. 5 years after Curt Teich and Company closed its doors, Motorola introduced the mobile phone, 1983. And then came flip phones, 1996, Blackberries, 1999, Apple iPhones, 2007, and ultimately the digital world's final death blow to the postcard communication, texting, Facebook in 2004, Twitter in 2006, and Instagram in 2010. Beyond that, ask your grandkids, because I haven't a clue what they're doing now, but that's the communication method. During the digital age, the postcard settled into its new role as a collectible piece of ephemera, where postcards recording American history joined photo albums recording family history, and as significant documents of Americans' visual cultural history, the postcard remains the go-to document in our nation's collective ancestry.com. That's the history of the postcard. Thank you. Any comments, any things that you've been collecting, any companies that you know about? How many have, I'm sure you all have Curt Teich postcards somewhere hidden away in your shoe boxes and the like. Hope you'll take a minute and look through some of the books over there. Just to give you an idea, the two latest ones that came out just literally in July and May of this year are the postcard books. The one on Ocean City's historic lodgings, which is a kind of overview of what people, where they stayed, you know, when they came to Ocean City, and then the other, and that's typical of any place. I mean, it happens to be Ocean City, but it's universal. The development starts with old shingle-clad hotels, then became sort of classical columned hotels in the 1920s, then tourist cabins that would take all kinds of U-shaped forms and various, you know, delineations, small gabled white cabins that you'd rent just the cabin and have a porch and the like. Then the motel grew from that, and it emerged particularly in the 40s through the 60s in Ocean City, but in many towns, coastal resort towns. And then ultimately that was taken over by larger apartment blocks, timeshares, condo towers, and the like. So all of that is in the first volume. It's a pictorial overview with some really interesting postcards. It's all postcard illustrations. And then the second one is the historic Boardwalk beach and bay. And it was interesting, I started to mention this earlier, there's a last section in that about the bay, which had to do with fishing, but mostly sailing, recreational sailing. And I had all these wonderful postcards, but I didn't know a yawl from a sloop. So I had a friend of mine who was a waterman his whole life and was a part of the Waterman Council up and down the Atlantic coast, monitoring what kinds of fish and how many you could catch and all kinds. He was absolutely an expert in water stuff. And I was, for a period of 3 or 4 weeks at the end of writing this thing, I would email him about every other day. Here's the postcard. What do you call it? Oh, that's a yawl, he'd say. And then he'd give me the you know, what the kind of configuration was. So I was able to at least use the proper language and show off the knowledge. I had no clue what I was saying. But anyway, it's in that last section with all these different boats. And what was funny about that was that he said, this is a whole look of racing. I think these were sloops, really large ones. He said, but the draft on these boats, sailboats, is way too much. He said you never would see those in Sinnapuxon Bay off of Ocean City, Maryland. You might see them racing around Newport, Rhode Island, but you wouldn't see them in Ocean City. So anyway, they're postcards that say greetings from Ocean City, and there they are, you know. So that's another one of those things where the sun is setting on the wrong place, you know, that the postcard said the heck. Well, it's good. Do you think, yes?
He introduced you as doctor, right?
Yes.
Are you a professor of any particular subject? And question number one. Question number two is, are you a postcard collector yourself?
Okay, real quick. If anybody's interested, I can sign some of these or dedicate them as well in the back, and I'll be right back there in a minute. I'm a sort of historic bird because I have Cornell University's first doctorate in the history of architecture, the first one they ever gave to anybody, which was kind of fun. It's 1973. And I then came directly from Cornell to Georgia Tech, and I taught in the architecture college at Georgia Tech my whole career. And I retired about 2011. And a lot of those books are since retirement. I call them my COVID book. I couldn't go anywhere, so I just sat there and pumped out these books. But anyway, my field was American architecture and cultural history, but I was interested in the whole slew of it. So,
We'll let you get back.
okay, sure.